Fairgrounds for the dead. I deliberately like to choose controversial or challenging titles, shall we say. What I want to look at isn't so much ghost trains, that sort of thing. It's more to do with prehistory. It's very specifically the prehistory of the area south of Ashwell, east of Baldock, west of Royston. It's the eastern half of the district of North Hertfordshire, where there is a very significant and important prehistoric landscape in the hills. It's one of the best anywhere in this region. Parts of it are very familiar. They've long been known because we have the Barrow Cemetery at Thurfield Heath and things like that. Other elements of this landscape have been discovered only recently, partly through development, partly through deliberate research. And no doubt there are many more places that we're still yet to discover. However, I think we're now in a position where we know enough about this landscape to understand in considerable detail what's going on in it during a crucial period for the development of this island. One of the things that you have to bear in mind is this is a period that covers 4 millennia and more. It's an inordinately long time, and we have to deal with long-term change because archaeologists often can't recognise things that happen over a scale of days, months, or sometimes even individual years. It's also anonymous, because that's the definition of prehistory. It's before there are written records. So we're dealing with a remote past in which we don't know the names of the actors. Ashwell isn't at the centre of the landscape, it's part of the broader picture. Ashwell lies in the north of this area. The area I'm looking at for today is this bit of landscape from the edge of Letchworth across, running south from Ashwell towards Royston. Runs from Ashwell in the north down to Rushden in the south. Haven't marked Rushden on the map. And there is a main focus on this sort of area, south of Ashwell. And it includes a distinctive landscape, the bit that I've highlighted in green, that for some years I've been calling the Baldock Bowl. The Baldock Bowl is not the cauldron that's on display in the museum, it's a landscape feature. The bowl itself is a shallow basin. It's defined by the Western Hills to the south, the Ivor Springs to the north. It's not a dramatic landscape, but when you're standing inside it, you appear to be surrounded by a ring of hills. The wider zone, particularly northeast from the Baldock Bowl, has some of the best prehistoric evidence from the whole of Hertfordshire, including some evidence of at least regional significance. Sorry, I get very behind on the slide. The Chalk Ridge is the dominant landscape feature. It's often known as the Icknield Zone, which has long been thought to be an important prehistoric routeway linking East Anglia with the Thames Valley. We now know that Icknield Way did not exist in remote prehistory. The earliest evidence we have for anything like the Icknield Way comes from the 1st century BC. So take with a very large dose of salt the claim on the Icknield Way Association's website that it is the oldest road in England. It is not, and that can be demonstrated, but that's another talk. The Chalk Ridge is a distinct landform, and at the moment it's a distinct ecological zone. It was different in the past, as we will discover, and it partly altered during the climatic downturn after 1184 BC, or whenever that happens to have occurred. The landforms themselves are a creation of the Pleistocene glaciations, the thing that we tend to call the Ice Age, which is actually 2 million years of very rapid climate change in both directions. We have dry valleys, and we have this distinctive rolling hill shape with the flatter lands to the north that run out into the Cambridgeshire Fens. It is not a landscape for which we've got good evidence for early prehistory. This is the time before the start of farming, around about 4000 BC. If you want to be thoroughly technical about it, it's the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. There are very few finds of this sort of date from the Ashwell area, or generally in this part of North Herts. Most of them are found in the Hitchin area. In Hitchin, they date from the Hoxnean interglacial, one of the warmer phases during the Ice Age, 424,000 to 375,000 years ago. The real significance here is that there's a land surface and a lake bed that survived from this very remote period. It extends from Hitchin out towards Great Offley, out towards Fisher's Green. It is a remarkable survival. Because we've got the evidence from the lake bed and the surrounding soils, we know that early humans were using this landscape in the remote past. We've got good evidence for the plant and animal resources that they were exploiting, partly from the lake bed deposits. The last ice sheet began to melt around 18,000 years ago. This was a long, slow process. But by 11,000 BC, and I've swapped now from thousands of years ago to real dates, there were permanent settlers arriving in Britain. These were hunter-gatherers who exploited mainly red deer as a source of meat. They also loved hazelnuts. We can see these people largely through their discarded flints. These are not people who built large-scale permanent settlements, at least not that we know of in this area. Unfortunately, none have been found in the Ashwell area. We've got some from Hitchin, we've got some from further to the west. What we do believe is that they're here because they're interested in the local plant and animal resources. So we've got some of these microliths, tiny flints from the Hitchin area, that suggest that they're exploiting the reeds and the waterfowl, the fish in the river valley, and the animals on the higher land. But Brexit Mark I, around 1650 BC, the Storega tsunami cuts through hills that linked Kent and the Pas-de-Calais. This was the last little bit of land joining Britain to the continent, and it disappeared literally overnight. It's not just rising sea levels that cut Britain off from the rest of Europe. It is this one huge disaster. What happens is there is a landslip underwater to the west of Norway. At that time, the Rhine and its tributary, the Thames, have a V-shaped estuary facing north. The wave gets funneled into this, which adds to its power. As the estuary becomes narrower, so the tsunami becomes increasingly powerful. And the land in between Dover and Calais didn't consist of chalk cliffs. It's soft, clay hills, and they are washed away in one go. Obviously not the full width of the Straits of Dover as they are today, but a channel is cut through those hills, probably on the French side. The importance of this is its disruption to migration routes, and it's probably not so much the humans, because they can get into boats and cross this new channel. The animals that they're dependent on can't do that. They're stuck. And what we begin to see is people are exploiting smaller territories. They begin to make permanent settlements in the landscape. They get an increasingly close relationship with animal herds. There is some evidence from butchered bones that they are deliberately selecting certain types of animal, certain ages and sexes of red deer for butchery. And they begin planting food sources close to their settlements. They're not farming. What they're doing is they're planting hazel trees close to where their houses are. The big change is when new settlers arrive from Europe around 4000 BC. These people brought domesticated crops and livestock with them. The ultimate origin of the crops is the Middle East. It's from northern Iraq, that sort of area. The livestock, some of that comes from the Middle East, but the cattle and pigs that they bring come from the belt of land between Ukraine and Poland. The impact of their arrival is irreversible. Once you introduce farming to an area that's inhabited entirely by hunter-gatherers, the lifestyle of the hunter-gatherers is disrupted. They are no longer free to roam that landscape because the farmers, quite plainly, need to protect their fields. They're keeping out the wild animals that may eat the crops. They're also keeping out people trampling across their crops. They're not interested in having the hunter-gatherers come and steal their cattle, their pigs, their sheep, their goats. That said, with the introduction of farming, it's not as if suddenly we go from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle overnight into a farming economy. People are still largely dependent for wild foodstuffs for much of the next 1,000, 2,000 years. Farming is a sort of insurance policy to give people a regular supply of meat and vegetables to top up what they can get from the landscape. But once you've started planting crops, raising animals, you're increasingly tied to one place. You can't move around the landscape in quite the way that you used to be able to when you had no ties to a specific piece of land. What we begin to see happening is they're creating monuments. And these monuments are the things that proclaim their ownership of the land. It begins almost straight away. Early in the 4th millennium, we get things known as earthen long barrows. What you can see here, this thing that looks like the outline of a footprint, is the ditch of a long barrow. The long barrow has since been ploughed away. But what we can see very nicely is there's a road comes through, from top right to bottom left. Those are its ditches. There is a driveway up to a Roman villa going off in that direction. But you can see how the road ditches disappear in the middle. That's where the mound was. The road went over the mound, and in subsequent centuries the mound has been ploughed away, taking the ditches with the soil. There are still some that are visible in the landscape. There's one on Thurfield Heath, in the middle of the golf course. It is one of the best preserved long barrows in eastern England. This one is on Claybush Hill, south of Ashwell, and there's another one east of Kingsland Way. These earthen long barrows aren't like the megalithic tombs that you may have visited in Western Britain, where you have chambers in which people can be buried over many centuries. These cover the burial of one individual or a small number of people, because once you put the mound over the top of the burial, you can't add to it. You can if you've got a chamber, but if you've just got a mound with burials underneath it, the only secondary burials you can add are into the top of it. We do know that people continued to visit these mounds for centuries. There were excavations in the 1930s of the burial mound on Thurfield Heath that found that there were repeated insertions of new burials into the top of the mound over many centuries. The mounds may have covered the remains of people who were viewed by their communities as the ancestors or the founders of those farms. We will never know this sort of thing for certain. But it forms a visible sign that the communities who maintain these monuments have rights to that bit of land. It's making a very public statement about ownership. Long barrows are also often associated with what are known as cursus monuments. A cursus consists of parallel ditches and banks that often run for a kilometre or more. There's one in Dorset that runs for over 11 kilometres across the landscape. They look like trackways. I don't know how well you can see it on here. Parallel lines coming down there. Often they're on the edge of different ecological zones. It's been shown that the Dorset cursus, for instance, has an open landscape to the west and a wooded landscape to the east. This one is on the very edge of the Baldock Bowl, which makes me think that perhaps the Baldock Bowl is a distinct ecological zone during prehistory. Because they look like tracks, it's been suggested that they may have been used in religious processions. Again, this is the sort of thing we will never know. But because they often make little kinks to visit long barrows, and the long barrows are covering the remains of people who might be ancestors, it's been suggested that they're to do with ancestor worship. Sometimes they include natural features like springs. This one begins at the springs of the River Ivor, which is just off the picture to the left. This one is at Nortonbury on the edge of Letchworth Garden City. There is another one that we know about in Sandon, up in the hills above Baldock. The third type of monument that these early farmers were making, what are known as causewayed enclosures. This isn't in North Hertfordshire, unfortunately. It's an area defined by discontinuous banks and ditches, which makes them impossible to defend. These are not forts or defensive settlements of any sort. They've got so many gaps between the banks and the ditches that they could easily be overrun. What we do know is that some were actually attacked. The end of the life of the causewayed enclosure at Crickley Hill in Gloucestershire came about under circumstances we don't know, but the banks are full of arrowheads. People have attacked it with bows and arrows. No two causewayed enclosures are alike. Their functions are very, very variable. Some were used seasonally, some are used all throughout the year, and they seem to fall into the gaps between territories. That is quite interesting. They're not the focal point of the territory, they're on the edges. And this makes them look as if they are fairgrounds. They appear to be gathering places. The thing is that the ditches often include human bones. Sometimes they're just bits of bone, but sometimes you'll get an entire leg. The rest of the body's gone, but it's a leg that was still a leg when it went into the ditch. And they are placed carefully. These are not bits of random bone that have fallen in. They have been deposited. These are the fairgrounds of the dead of my title. One of the functions of such places appears to be the exposure of the dead, what's known as sky burial. where you lay out the corpse, the meat is eaten as carrion, and you then collect up the bones at a later date. It's something that appears quite repulsive to us, but there are still societies that practice sky burial, these days predominantly in Tibet. The belief in Tibet is that the living part of the body is the flesh. The bones are mere mineral. In Tibet, what they do is they strip the flesh from the bones, they put it on a platform, they then grind up the bones to use as fertiliser in the fields. The flesh is eaten by eagles, and the belief is that the spirit of the deceased is being taken to the sky by the eagles who have eaten the flesh. Without trying to draw too many parallels, because you can't make exact comparisons between cultures widely separated in time and space, perhaps some similar idea was in the minds of the people who were exposing their relatives in these causewayed enclosures. Now, why have I been talking about them? I think we've got one. Thrift Hill in Kelshall, south of the A505. I was looking at Google Earth and I saw this pattern, and it's discontinuous ditches, and they're concentric. And I was about to write an email to the then county archaeologist when I received an email from the then county archaeologist saying, "Have you seen this at Thrift Hill in Kelshall? What do you think it looks like?" And Stuart and I both think that it is a causewayed enclosure. What's interesting here is that it's a site that has been metal detected. It's produced finds of many different dates, including non-metal finds that include Neolithic flint work. It's also a very prominent hill. If you're travelling by train between Baldock and Royston, it is one of the most distinctive hills in the ridge to the south of you. And it's on the interface between the hills of North Hertfordshire and the Cambridgeshire Plain. So in other words, it's a classic location for this sort of monument. They're often found between different ecological zones, just like the Cursus monuments. And what I suspect is that we've got arable farming down at the foot of the hill and pasture on the clay lands at the top. It's highly visible from the north. It has a very, very distinctive valley to the west. This road runs through a very steep side, very narrow valley called Coombe Bottom. And the whole complex appears to be a very significant element in the landscape. The finds run from the Neolithic, early farming, right the way through to the 10th century AD, almost without a gap. There is something significant here, and my suggestion is this is our local fairground for the dead, and continued to be for many millennia after the Neolithic come to an end. The dead have a particular importance in Neolithic society. You find human bones on any Neolithic site that you excavate, whether it's a settlement, a quarry, an industrial site, flint extraction, or burial site. You will always find human bones, and they appear to have been curated. In other words, they have been looked after. People have been handling them. Sometimes the bones have a very distinctive polish on them, and it's a polish that you only get by repeated handling. It's the sweat and the grease from your hands that gets into the bone, and it gives it a very distinctive appearance, even thousands of years later. And in some tombs, chambered tombs, you often find that skeletons are not a single individual. They're made up from the bones of body parts of different people. And there is an example from an earthen long barrow in Cambridgeshire at Haddenham, where the skeleton is actually half a dozen different people who've been put together by somebody who obviously knows their anatomy. This suggests that bones are a familiar aspect of everyday life within the Neolithic. Remains of the dead are important in ways that they aren't to us today. They're not something that people are squeamish about. You might handle grandmother's skull occasionally. You might bring out a great-grandparent's leg while you're having a specific feast. It's a completely different mindset. It's an attitude to the dead that we have long since forgotten about. And as I've mentioned, some of these causewayed enclosures appear to be where the dead were exposed in this phenomenon known as sky burial. So the causewayed enclosure looks to have been a seasonal meeting place. And it's somewhere where goods could be exchanged, where social networks were reinforced. They're in between territories, so it's somewhere where you meet the neighbours, but not the neighbours in the next settlement. These are the neighbours from further away. It's also a ritual site, where the dead were being brought and they're being redistributed. In the way that trade goods are being redistributed, so are the dead. They're being split up between different communities. And I think part of this is remembrance of the dead, remembrance of times gone by. You can tell stories about the dead of your community. You can be proud of the achievements of your ancestors. You can learn about the achievements of the ancestors of the neighbouring communities. And ultimately, it is a community site. The individual ditches are these dug by individual family lines. One group of cousins is responsible for this ditch, another group of cousins is responsible for that one. And we know that they are regularly cleaned out. Might they be symbolic of plough furrows? These are communities who are beginning to plough the land. They're making alterations to the land surface. This is a more permanent form of plough furrow. Are the objects that are put in them gifts that are being returned to the earth? Neolithic people were clearly very conscious of the idea that most of the stuff they used came from the ground, whether it's plant, animals eat the plants, or flint and clay. Everything comes up from the earth at root. By about 3000 BC, this pattern has completely fallen apart. Something happened. We don't know what it is. They stopped building long barrows for a start, and instead they built what are known as oval barrows. Some archaeologists used to call them short long barrows, which is a very bizarre title. Oval barrows, much better title. This is William Ransom excavating the oval barrow at, not high down, it's on the edge of Burton anyway. The county boundary between Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire runs through the middle of it. This was 1854. Knocking Knoll on Knocking Hoe in Burton. All the causewayed enclosures that have been built and all the curses that have been in use are now abandoned. They fall completely out of use, and a new pattern emerges. And at first it's based on a new type of monument, what's called the formative henge. We've got one locally at Norton, in between Church Lane and the A1 motorway. That is the easternmost that has so far been identified. These are large circular monuments, and they seem initially to have had the same sort of role as causewayed enclosures. But because of the nature of these henges, we've got better evidence for the sorts of activities that take place inside. Another change that happens after about 3000 BC is we get these beautifully made stone objects, axe heads, being traded across Britain and Ireland, and some even come from Scandinavia. We used to think of them as items of trade. We live in a society in which we are accustomed to mercantile trade, a capitalist society in which goods are exchanged for other goods or services, or ultimately money. That's actually very, very unlikely in the Neolithic. We're dealing with a prehistoric society in which trade of that sort probably wouldn't ever have entered people's minds. What we get from the archaeology is the idea that these are not being traded long distances. They're going from person to person, from community to community. Eventually they travel a long way, but there is a huge drop-off between the quarry sites and the next place along, and further. It's an exponential curve that shows that they are widely distributed close to where they're being pulled from the ground and shaped. And as you get further away, so fewer of them are being passed on. And I think this is quite significant. This person-to-person exchange gives each axe head a biography. People can tell stories about these objects. They acquire almost a personality as they are moving along. And people know they have come from an unimaginable distance away, beyond the horizon. If you go to the horizon, it's beyond the horizon you can see there. And beyond the horizon from there. These are things that have travelled more than the people in these communities are ever likely to travel in their lifetimes. There is a greenstone axe from Ashwell that was found west of Westbury Farm. The thing is, even if they've got these lovely stories and biographies attached to them, they are very, very practical items. They are incredibly efficient at chopping down trees. You'd never take a real Neolithic axe head and try it, but you can make a reproduction. They work very, very well. They can be resharpened. This one, only photo I had, is actually from Welwyn Garden City, but it's been repolished at least twice. It's been resharpened as it blunted. So it has seen serious use. We hope chopping down trees rather than people. Now we have a number of henges in the area. This one is at Waltons in Ashwell, discovered in May 2015 in advance of development work. That's how most things are discovered these days. Previously, it had been thought to be a Bronze Age burial mound because it shows as a ring-shaped ditch on the aerial photographs. However, excavation shows that it's what's known as a Class 2 henge. There's a really simple classification system for henges. Class 1 henges have one entrance. Class 2 henges have two entrances. There is one Class 4 henge, which has 4 entrances. That's Avebury. Wasn't known to be a henge because the bank has been completely ploughed away. And unlike the causewayed enclosures, the banks for henges are on the outside of the ditch. They cannot be defended. This one has no bank left, but there were little traces of it around the edge of the ditch. It appears to have been sited in Ashwell to overlook the springs of the River Cam. And around the springs there are large numbers of Neolithic flint. It will be contemporary with this. What's really intriguing is it's just like the formative henge at Norton, where the entrance overlooks the springs of the River Ivor. And this one attracts cremation burials at the end of its use. As it falls into disuse towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC, they start depositing cremation burials inside it. That also happened at Norton. These two sites, just a few miles apart, have almost identical histories. What happens after 3000 BC is that most monuments are now circular or oval. We've gone from the long linear things, such as curses, or the more irregular causewayed enclosures, or long barrows. We've now got oval barrows, round barrows, henges. Henges now give us the evidence for what people are doing inside them. There seems to be feasting, lots of bits of cooked animal bone, broken animal bone, and lithic production. They are making flint tools inside these places. They are cut off from the outside world by a high bank. They are enclosed sites. We get round barrows, burial mounds, which are circular, usually, that cover inhumation burials, in other words, skeletons. Most of them are individuals, but occasionally we still get groups of people. We're also looking at an emphasis on features in the natural world, things like springs, hills, valleys, places where you can see the sun rising and setting. Inside a henge, you have a restricted view of this outside world. It focuses you on the sky and whatever you can see through the entrance. That is very, very obvious from the Norton henge, where the only thing you'd have been able to see from inside it are the springs of the River Ivor. And at the equinox, the spring and autumn sunrises immediately over the springs off to the east. You also get a sense that people are partying in these places. The activities look quite wild and uncontrolled. There's a lot of broken pottery, there's a lot of burnt animal bone, there's a lot of broken flint. Everything is broken. And my suspicion is that they're consuming large quantities of alcohol and who knows what else. At this period, people are moving around. We're looking now at the period after about 2500 BC, the world of the classic henges. And this is where we probably get the origins of trade. There is a new material that people want, that is only found in restricted places. Copper. Copper is being used initially to make this sort of thing, flat axes. And it's recently been suggested that there's large-scale settlement using ancient DNA evidence. There have been claims that the old Neolithic population is just about wiped out. Until you go away and you read the scientific paper on which it's based. This is what got into the newspapers. This is based on 7 skeletons. That is not enough, to my mind, to demonstrate complete population replacement. And when you look at the archaeology, you don't see a sudden break in tradition. If you're getting population replacement, the new people are going to do things differently from the old people. They don't. Henges continue to be used throughout this period. They're not abandoned. You've not got evidence for people whose way of life is different, whose houses are different, whose pottery is different. Things are simply changing through time. There is no dramatic change of population. What is changing is that people can now express wealth and individuality in a way that they didn't during the Neolithic. We get a slow shift from a society in which people share burial rights to one where there is an emphasis on the individual grave. And at the same time, we get a move towards cremation as the principal rite for disposal of the dead. They're no longer putting the bodies in the ground, they're no longer exposing them, they are burning them. And I'm just intrigued by the fact that this parallels the development of metallurgy. And I wonder if people are looking at the transformation of an ore, a not particularly attractive piece of stone, going through the fire and coming out as this lovely, shining yellow metal. Do they think that something is happening to the human soul, being transformed by burning on the cremation pyre? It is being refined, like the ore, into something finer. Okay. These are ideas. We will never know this sort of thing. The burial mounds of this period survive relatively well as upstanding monuments in the landscape I'm talking about. Places like Highley Hill, Meckley Hill, Gallows Hill. This one is Meckley Hill in Wallington to the east of Bulldog. There's a burial from Caldecott with a beaker that has been radiocarbon dated. It's one of the few things in this landscape that's ever had decent radiocarbon dates. And even there, we've got a 500-year span, somewhere between 2200 and 1700 BC. The beaker itself, the clay analysis, suggests it was almost certainly made locally. In graves of this period, we get gifts of certain classes of material. The beaker in the grave at Caldecott. The chap at Caldecott also had some arrowheads with him. It suggests that there is something going on during the funeral, that it's not just a matter of putting the body in the ground and covering it over. If you're putting in gifts as well, that looks a lot more like a ceremony that is not just the committal of the body to the earth. There is something more complex going on. It allows the mourners to display their power, wealth, and prestige. Always remember, it's not the dead who organise their funerals, it's the living. And the living want to make statements about the dead person, but it's even more important to make a statement about yourself to your neighbours. It's a chance for people to show off. It shows their position in a social network. It also helps to deal with social anxiety over keeping these networks going. When somebody who may have been a key member of that network is no longer with you. It's a way to form ties that that person had in their life that you haven't necessarily already got. Particularly if they are the leading, and I have to say this, man of the society. It's very unlikely that we're looking at a matriarchal society here. We're almost certainly dealing with a society where they are male warriors who are the elites. What's beginning to happen with the development of metalwork is what's being described as the world's first arms race. People are using this new material to develop weapons in addition to tools. And increasingly, they're trying to find more efficient ways of killing each other. We get the invention of the dagger. The dagger is up to about that long, then the dirk, which is up to about that long, and finally the sword. The longer your blade, the more distant you can be from the person you're trying to kill. If you've got a dagger, there's always a chance they can hit you over the head with their stone axe. If you've got a sword, they're not going to get that axe anywhere near you. Metal weapons are also very visible. A nice, bright, shining, brand new bronze sword is an impressive object. So these are presumably a source of prestige to their owners. Well, who are people fighting and why are they fighting them? It's very unlikely to be organised warfare with armies. We're not looking at a state political system here. What we're thinking about is much more likely to be small groups of warriors. They might be raiding for cattle, they might be raiding for slaves, they might be raiding for other resources. This is not warfare in the way that we think of warfare in the last few centuries. What's interesting in the Bronze Age is that we can see the dead. The dead are all over the place. We've got their burials, we've got bits of their bone. Finding the living is a real challenge. It used to be very, very difficult to find anything that looked like a Bronze Age settlement. There is a roundhouse, this one, from the Baldock bypass. I don't have a photograph of it, I just have a drawing from the publication of that excavation. Most of the structures of this period seem to have been relatively flimsy. There's a good reason for that. The climate is much warmer than it is today. It's also drier. This period, the climate is a bit like southern France. Much nicer. There are also a few village-like enclosures of this period. However, throughout the first millennium BC, much of it, more effort is put into making tombs visible. And there is one really obvious parallel to this. Ancient Egypt. That's a Bronze Age society. There are pyramids from throughout the Egyptian Bronze Age. Very, very few settlement sites that are permanent enough to remain as monuments in that landscape. We do know they exist, but they're always mud brick. They're buried under Nile silts. The tombs are the prominent things. And we know something about Egyptian society. We know that the pharaoh doesn't die. After death, the pharaoh becomes the sun. He travels in the solar arc around the earth every 24 hours. The dead remain prominent to the living, at least the prominent dead remain important to the living. And I think this is what's going on in Bronze Age societies locally, that the important people have to remain visible even once they've gone to meet their maker. In 1159 BC, or thereabouts, there's an eruption of Mount Hekla in Iceland. This was one of the biggest natural ecological disasters that we know about. It seems to have shrouded the northern hemisphere in dust, creating something akin to a nuclear winter. It appears to have happened in 1159 BC. This is done from counting layers of ice in the Greenland ice sheet, and it usually comes out at 1159. This has been suggested to have links with various events in world history. The descent of the peoples of the sea on ancient Egypt. Is it the fall of the Chu dynasty in China or something like that? There are various things that happen in the middle of the 12th century BC, and Mount Hekla has been blamed for all of them. Well, the date's disputed. Some of these events may have happened earlier, some of them seem to have happened around about 1600 BC. Nevertheless, in the middle of the 12th century BC, there is a climatic catastrophe. This is visible in the archaeology, and it is quite well dated. Britain very quickly becomes cooler, it becomes wetter. Upland farming is no longer viable, and we get the development of blanket moss on previously farmed land. And this happens in a band that stretches from Ireland in the west across to Hungary in the east. This is a Europe-wide phenomenon. You can still go up onto bits of the Pennines, look at the blanket moss, and pull out bits of wood that were alive in the Middle Bronze Age. The preservation is quite amazing. The soils vanish almost instantly. As soon as it starts getting wetter, nobody's thought about how to maintain the soils on the tops of the hills. The soil literally washes away. And the only thing that can grow up there is the moss. And that's why these areas of outstanding natural beauty are actually an ecological disaster zone. And it shows how beauty can come out of human-made disasters. There are effects in North Hertfordshire. We get heathland that develops on the hills. Parts of the hills were not ever cultivated again until the 1950s. Generally, it was about the 1920s when areas of heathland started being brought back under the plan. Settlements of this period also become visible because they're defended. Some of them survive as things that we call hill forts, like Arbury Banks and Wilbury. On the other hand, most of them seem to have started out just as simple palisaded enclosures. These are areas that are fenced off, inside which a village is growing up. We've also got some palisaded enclosures visible from aerial photography that don't develop into hill forts. There's one in Kelshall, for instance. And these suggest that what's going on is more to do with a change in agricultural practice. It's not military. There are no invading armies. This is to do with keeping cattle or some other form of livestock inside fenced-off enclosures. Having gone through 1,000 years where we can't see the living, we're now faced with 1,000 years where we can't see the dead. When I was an undergraduate, there was a not very good joke that our lecturers used to make, that nobody ever lived in the Bronze Age, they only died, and nobody ever died in the Iron Age, they only lived. Because in the Bronze Age you can only see their burials, in the Iron Age you can only see their settlements. What happens is that after this climatic downturn, the way in which people are disposing of the dead changes so completely that we don't get the cremation burials, we don't get the skeletons in the ground. They're no longer considered an important aspect of the landscape. They're vanishing from it. They're rarely given any sort of monument for much of the first millennium BC. It's not until the very end of it that we start seeing a change again. I think that what's going on is that there is less social anxiety over death. People aren't so worried about what happens when a member of the community dies. There isn't so much of a need to show off during the funeral of members of society. And that perhaps there is an alternative way of remembering the dead. As with the Neolithic, it's very difficult to excavate a first millennium site without finding bits of human bone. And often, like the Neolithic bone, these are highly polished. There's a pit up at Jack's Hill near Gravely, where there are 3 bits of human skull. They are polished, the edges around it. They have been handed from person to person, probably over many, many years. They're remembering the dead not as the person who's buried under that mound over there. They're remembering them because they are communicating directly with that person. They may be long dead, but they've got them in their hand. They can deal with that individual. And these bits of bone are almost always small scraps. So you wonder, are the bodies being divided up and spread between communities? The other big change of the first millennium BC is that the landscape is being cleared of any residual woodland. There is this bizarre idea of primeval forest, and much of Britain being covered in woodland so dense that only things like the Icknield Way can travel through it. Britain has never supported that kind of dense woodland. Most of our soils are too thin, and certainly in North Hertfordshire, with the chalk hills, often with clay on the top, it's never going to get anything more than scrubland developing on it, if left to its own devices. But what we do see is that more and more land is being turned over to agriculture. And if you're doing that, it's presumably because the population is growing. You have more mouths to feed, so you need more fields to produce the foodstuffs for them. From the 6th century onwards, we begin to see development of what appear to be individual tribes. I hate the term tribes. These are political units who identify themselves from their neighbours by very distinctive styles of pottery. That's all. It's the pottery of a political unit, not an ethnic group. And by the 1st century BC, we know we've got kingdoms. By the end of the 1st century BC, the kings are putting their names on coins and occasionally calling themselves king anyway. So that's what they thought of themselves. So we can see the gradual emergence of political units, which by the time writing comes around, are definitely to be called kingdoms. We're also beginning to see centralisation of power. People are putting resources into building things like hill forts. Hill forts often have relatively sizable communities living inside them, a few hundred people perhaps, but still not enough to work on creating these enormous banks and ditches and maintaining them. They're clearly able to draw on people from outside the enclosed village to help build the enclosure and to maintain it. And occasionally we get high status dwellings. Here is one in Barley. This is Whiteley Hill. That's the road that runs from Royston to Barley. And you've got this double ditch right on the top of the hill. It was excavated by Mary Craster in the 1950s, as a result of which we know an awful lot about it. It's a single farm with its own double-ditched enclosure. This is somebody of considerable importance in local society. Whether or not they thought of themselves as a king, we will never know. This dates from the first few centuries of the first millennium BC, so about 1000 to about 700 BC, something like that. In the Middle Iron Age, period from about 600 to 200 BC, Britain becomes very inward-looking. There has been widespread overseas trade throughout the Bronze Age, into the early Iron Age, and then suddenly that comes to an end. We don't know exactly why, but we begin to see that groups are beginning to define themselves through the things they make and own, through their material culture. And we get regionally distinctive ceramics. This is a pedestal cup from Ravensborough Castle in Hexham. That is a style that's only found in the northeastern Chilterns. So it suggests that what we're getting is a Chiltern identity being formed. Trade does continue between the southeast and Europe, and we get the introduction of decorative styles belonging to the Latin culture. This is named after a site in Switzerland where these specific styles were first identified. By about 300 BC, there seemed to be increasing internal tensions. There is a suggestion that we're looking at a period of endemic warfare by that sort of time. As the tribes become more consolidated, rivalries between neighbouring groups seem to be taking over. And during the 2nd century BC, the landscape is transformed. The old centres of power, places like Arbury Banks and Wilbury Hill, become peripheral to what's going on. They're not abandoned, they remain as settlements. But what we begin to see, the construction of things like this, these massive ditch systems, they seem to be to do with the growth of a new settlement at Baldock. It's a new territory that focuses on the Baldock Bowl. Is this consolidation in the centre of an old pattern? Are they simply moving into a central part of the territory? Or is it something completely new? At Baldock, we get the early appearance of a type of pottery known as grog tempered wares. It used to be called Belgic. We no longer attach terms like that to pots because pots are not the same as people. It's one of the earliest places in the country to have this sort of pottery. And Baldock is north of a zone that's using sandy wares. And the sandy wares are typical of the rest of the Iron Age in this part of the world. So these people using rock-tempered wares look as if they're doing something completely new. It looks like a real new order. And ultimately, round about 100 BC, slightly before, there's a burial. And it's the earliest of what's known as a Welling-type burial ever found anywhere. And this is a specific type of burial that is found across southeast Britain and northeastern Gaul, like northern France and Belgium, effectively. They consist of cremation burial in a large pit with fire dogs, things for putting logs on for the fire, a cauldron, expensive metalwork, and Roman amphorae. This is what we've got at Baldock, and we know it's from before 100 BC because the amphora that's in it is a Dressel 1A. It's the only Dressel 1A ever found in this country, and Dressel 1As go out of production by 100 BC. So we're looking at a 2nd century BC burial. It's also got some Etruscan bronze dishes of 2nd century date in it. What we're looking at with the Welling-type burials is the adoption of Mediterranean tastes and, even more importantly, behaviours. And what it suggests is that we've got power being concentrated in this new settlement. This is a composite. It's actually at least 2 separate tripod buckets. Now, you should not assume that these are things that people would fill with water to go out and wash the chariot with. They are actually punch bowls. They are for mixing wine and water. In the classical world, it was considered very, very bad form indeed to drink your wine neat. The only people who drank neat wine were drunks or soldiers. If you were in polite society, you would mix it with water. Having something like this helps in social rituals. You can demonstrate order of precedence as the king by inviting people to come up in order to dip in their cups to get their mixed wine and water. We've got a minimum of 2 of these buckets in this barrel. There is another barrel from Bulldog that also has a bucket in it. They are important social indicators of how society works. The other thing that's interesting is that this is going on as these dikes are being built across the landscape. Those dikes often have 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 ditches. And in every instance, at least one of the ditches is earlier than the others. I am working on the idea that each generation comes along and digs a new ditch. It's renewing the system, not by cleaning out the old ditch. That happens anyway. You have to do it because it will silt up. But you are reinscribing your possession of that landscape on it by digging a new section of dike parallel to the old one. You're not changing the system, you are adding to it. And with Bulldog, everything changes. I can't underemphasise the importance locally of the development of Bulldog. It's the beginning of urbanisation. By the time Julius Caesar gets to this country, there is a settlement in Bulldog that is proto-urban. It has a large rectangular enclosure that looks like a royal enclosure, similar to the one that's been identified in St Albans, that's at least a generation later, and it's surrounded by houses and inns. There are contacts with the Roman world. The person who was buried in the late 2nd century BC has wine in a dressel one amphora. That's used for transporting wine from Campania in Italy. You're beginning to see production centralised. Distribution is centralised. These grog-tempered wares, by the end of the 1st century BC, and we are still in prehistory here, they are being made in factories. They are being made in standard sizes and designs. They are being shipped out in large quantities to important settlements. The other thing about Bulldog is it's in the core of a territory that is chock full of religious sites. And I wonder, are these something new, or have they already been there over the previous 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 4,000 years? Are these things invisible to us because they're not marked by earthworks? Might they still be there, waiting for us to come along? And right at the start, I mentioned this wretched Icknield Way. Now, I said it's a separate talk, but most standard books on local history will have mentioned it by now. I did, right at the start, only to dismiss it. In recent years, the whole idea of the Icknield Way has come in for some quite detailed criticism, particularly by somebody called Sarah Harrison. She was at the University of East Anglia in the late 1990s and did research into the archaeology of Icknield Way. She was looking for the earliest date at which we can say the Icknield Way exists. And to cut a very long story short, she found there is no evidence whatsoever for its existence in prehistory. And in fact, she can demonstrate that there are certain parts of it that can't have existed in prehistory. There's a bit on the Berkshire Downs where a Bronze Age ditch goes from one side of the hill to the other. That ditch was still open in the Roman period. You could not have used the Icknield Way because the Icknield Way runs across the ditch. There's another bit at Aston Clinton where the lower Icknield Way and upper Icknield Way are completely crisscrossed by a Roman field system. There is no Icknield Way in those areas. However, there is one single stretch where she found there is archaeological evidence, and it's between Baldock and Dunstable. And where there is evidence for it, Baldock and Letchworth Garden City, where its line has been excavated, it's created in the 1st century BC. That's the origin of Icknield Way. So, what about further afield? Well, Valerie Hurst, who's a landscape archaeologist working in Cambridgeshire, has rediscovered this thing called Avenel Way. It's mentioned in various medieval documents. It runs through Bassingbourn and Linklington, and it joins the A505 at Odsey. The A505 is the traditional line of Icknield Way. Like the Icknield Way of Baldock and Letchworth, it also dates from the late Iron Age. The line continues as the A505 to the southwest, where it's called the Icknield Way. East of Odsey, this bit, there is no archaeological evidence whatsoever that it's an ancient route. And if it isn't, it explains a real anomaly. We've got Ermine Street coming through there, through the centre of Royston. There ought to be an important Roman settlement if that's a major crossroads. There is nothing. The Roman settlement in Royston is down there. There is a Roman settlement there, where Avenel Way crosses Ermine Street. So, I think we should rename the bit between Baldock and Dunstable Avenel Way. And just to make the point, can you tell me where one branches off from the other on that? They are clearly one single line. I'm winding up. Oh, good Lord, it's 2:15. I'm sorry about that. As I said, I do overrun. In the ancient world, and by extension in prehistory, the landscape is full of meaning. Places had spiritual attributes. There are nature spirits in the trees, the springs, the animals, all around. And there are stories, myths, that might be universal, explaining how the world came to be. They might be very local, explaining why this dead tree is leaning over that particular angle. There's clearly something special about the Baldock Bowl and the surroundings of the Baldock Bowl. And it's quite clear to me that this was a landscape that was seen as very special for more than 4,000 years. There is a concentration of religious monuments in the Baldock Bowl specifically, which I haven't dealt with in detail, that go right up to the arrival of Christianity. Some of it's connected with water, and especially springs. Some of it seems to be connected with hills. And all of it is to do with the natural world. I think this is what we are looking at in trying to understand these fairgrounds for the dead. These are places where people come together, they learn about each other, they learn about the world around them, they tell stories, they exchange gifts, they exchange bits of their families with each other. They are presumably making new connections. If you are looking for a husband or a wife, this is the ideal place to go. You are marrying somebody from outside the community. So these fairgrounds are not just for the dead, they're also for the living. It's just we can see the dead as archaeologists, not the living. So, sorry that I've gone on. I did warn you, so you can't say you weren't warned at the outset. I hope I haven't made anybody late. Thank you for listening.